Welcome back to the Raising Rock podcast. I am Elise and I am your host. Before I even get into who the guest is today, this is not an episode for little ears. So pause, get your kids out of the room, put your headphones in. I'm talking slow because I'm giving you some time. Okay, fair warning. I'm going to get into who the guest is. So today we have on Kristen Miele from Sex Ed Reclaimed. Her Instagram is Sex Ed Reclaimed, and that's probably how you would have heard of her. She has an incredible sex education curriculum for your kids. So we've had a lot of guests on the episodes that have talked about how to talk to your kids about porn. And as parents, like, what do these conversations look like? How do you teach your kids about sexuality? This is more of a tool for you to use with your children. It's modules your kids can watch about sex and sex education that is biblical. It's rooted in God's word, but it's also sex education. And it's taking what can be an awkward or difficult conversation for us as parents, and it's helping lead the way and start the conversations and introducing topics. And what she's so good at doing is really teeing it up for us as parents of, okay, I'm going to introduce this topic to your kids, but then you're the one watching it with them. So if they have questions, you're there to answer their questions. So you still are the main resource for your child in this. You're still the main educator, but she's really helping and facilitating some of the difficult parts. Fair warning on this episode, we do use some language that might not typically be used on a podcast or that I'm used to using in public, like an erection, masturbation, topics that we need to talk about with our kids at some point. But you'll see, I even got awkward talking about it with her, and I fumbled on my words, and part of me wants to re-record the entire episode and make it appear to all of you guys like I wasn't awkward and I handled this conversation perfectly and it was my best interview ever. But it was not. It was awkward and difficult for me, and it was not my best. But I'm leaving it that way because it is the reality of these conversations. They aren't always fun. They are awkward. They can be difficult, but what I love about Kristen is she says, take the fear out of this conversation with your children and look at it as an opportunity. Like, you get to have this conversation with your child. You get to teach them about these things that if they just go into the world and ask about, for example, an erection, you only know how distorted their thinking is going to become on that topic. But we get the opportunity to introduce it to them in a God-honoring, biblical way. God designed all of it. There is a purpose for all of it. But how do we teach them about that? So Sex Ed Reclaimed, I cannot wait to purchase it myself and walk through it with my own children. Kristen was an amazing resource on how to have these conversations with your kids. Even if you don't go and purchase her curriculum, I still think this is an amazing episode for you because we do get very granular and specific on different things that you can say to your kids and how to start introducing some of these topics. And either way, whether you get the curriculum or you don't, it is an amazing episode full of really practical tips and tricks to discuss these difficult topics with our children. So I will be buying the curriculum and I will be reporting back to all of you with how it went and how the conversations went with my kids. I just love everything about what she was saying. I can't wait for you to hear from her and learn yourself about what Sex Ed Reclaimed is and why it is such an important tool for our families. Before we get into the episode with Kristen, my usual spiel. Please pause, follow, like, subscribe, leave a comment, leave a review. Everything that you do to engage with our content really does help us become more discoverable to a new audience. We are always trying to book new guests, and the more visibility that the guests have to our content and the reviews that you're leaving and the engagement they see between you as the audience and us as the content creators makes them want to spend their time and join our show. So please, 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 it helps so much. As always, I'm so thankful that you guys choose to trust us and spend time with us on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Pacific time. That is when we release a new episode every week. And with that, Kristen from Sex Ed Reclaimed. Welcome to the show. What is at risk with parents if they choose to not talk to their children about sex?
You're jumping right in. I love this.
I'm jumping right in.
There are many things that come to mind when you ask that question, and it's a little bit of the answer to that question that fuels my passion for this curriculum and for the company and the work that I do. And so what stands at risk is that your kids go off into the world, whether on a daily basis as they interact with their friends and their schools and their communities, or whether they leave home one day, which they will, and are unprepared for what they're about to face and know that you won't have the answers for them, potentially, depending on your relationship. Why? Because so many of us, if you think about what we went through and what we experienced, when the vast majority of Christian parents were pretty silent on this topic or fairly legalistic, like do this, but don't do this, this is for that, and that's for that, and this is the end of the story, no more. That means we went out into the world. We dealt with the internet and pornography. We dealt with all of these new trends coming out in the world that weren't super common when we were kids in the 90s and 80s and before. And we knew our parents wouldn't talk about them. And so we asked other people and we looked on the internet and we found friends who would talk to us. And that's the same thing. That is not going to change. That's the same thing that kids are going to do today. So what's at risk is that they find their primary information about sex, sexuality, dating, and puberty from other sources. And I don't need to tell parents that those other sources are not going to be great. Like we all know that. And when you think about it, that was our experience too. It's just that we weren't living in today's day and age. In fact, it's only gotten more information, right? Heavy and more sources can now input into our child's life than what we had when we were kids. But even back when we were kids, it wasn't great. So that's really what's at risk. And you think about the implications of that risk when your primary source of information about the topic is other places, then you can really start to see how far this can go in terms of their vulnerabilities.
You have spent years helping parents navigate these conversations, educating children on sex and the sex conversation. What happens when parents wait too long? Is it the same answer that the world will educate them? Like, is there this sweet spot of have this conversation at this age, don't wait until this age? Like, what's at risk if we just, okay, I'm going to have the conversation, Kristen. I'll do it. I just don't want to do it now. My kid feels too young.
Yes, I get that question a lot and that fear a lot. And I'm very much the type of educator and mom that says we should not lead with fear. And so if you think about it, that question really has like a scared feeling to it. And that is not what I want to propel parents with ultimately. And so I'm going to switch like the framework of my answer to your question a little bit into think about not just what could happen if the world disciples your child on this topic, and if the shame and secrecy that enters in affects the rest of their life, their future marriages, their relationship, etc. But think about the opportunity you have with your children now, like this week, today, this month, this year, in terms of this conversation. So leaving that framework behind of, oh my goodness, I have to have this conversation, or I need to jump this hurdle with them, or, oh, that's the thing I'm most worried about, or there's so much risk out there if I don't do it, so I better do it. Instead of all of that, try to, with the Lord and like discernment, move into a space of what do I get to do with my kids? Like, what do I get to disciple them in? How do I look at this conversation as an opportunity to not only disciple them, but to have fellowship with them, to understand their worldview and what they're thinking about what's going on around them, and get to know them better. Like that is a beautiful thing. And that takes the conversations about sex away from this kind of fear-based, oh shoot, I have to do this and I'm going to miss out and I'm not going to do it right. And what's going to happen to them if, into, wow, what an opportunity I have with my child on such an important topic that will impact them forever. And that's really cool.
I couldn't agree more. It really is such a gift that we have this time with our children when they are young to teach them and impart this information that we have in a biblical way. Like that's like the number one thing I'm the most passionate about right now with my kids is I have so many things in culture that I can draw from to teach you about. And it is such a gift and an opportunity that I have to be able to tell you about all of these things in a God honoring, stewarding way. And to not just be like, YOLO, the world can, it's a rough world out there, figure it out. Like, I am so thankful that it's not that and that I can just be so intentional and steward these conversations so well. It's like my new passion in life. I was not as passionate about this 2 years ago as I am now, but I'm like, how cool that I get to go see everything that's happening in the world and figure out how to like frame this up in a way that is God honoring and teach it to my children.
Absolutely. And looking at the world as an opportunity, I think, is even more probably evangelical in its mindset, right? Like what is out there that is happening that is against the Lord? What is happening that's out there that is a teaching opportunity? What can I really do to engage with my child on this matter instead of ignoring it? Like I think about right now when we're filming, it's Pride Month, and so many parents would prefer to ignore that, right? And just kind of like ignore that conversation and not really talk about it too much and just say, well, it's against God's design and the end. But in reality, it's all around us, so many of us. And so that is an opportunity for us to say, hey, this is what God's plans are. This is where people are at. This is how this is different than what God's plan is, and this is how we can minister to that group of people or how we can love them or whatever it might be, right? And so using those opportunities in your world to say this is how we meet that place where it's at, but we still know the truth is really how we disciple them in truth and love. And I think sex is a huge opportunity to do that.
I couldn't agree more. When I hear the term sex ed, I have a very clear mental picture that comes into my brain. I can picture awkward fifth, sixth graders sitting in a classroom hearing about sex. I picture the Mean Girls movie and the teacher saying, if you have sex, you will get pregnant and you will die. I feel like our world has just completely destroyed how good sex ed can be. So, what is your perspective on sex ed and what is sex ed reclaimed?
Yes, that's a great question. So, my perspective on sex ed is that it's education about sex. I have a very simplistic understanding of sex ed at its root. But to be clear, I think about the same things you think about. That coach in the Mean Girls movie being like, if you have sex, you'll get pregnant and die. And the reason they made that scene and it was funny is because it was so relatable to us. Like we all got that. And we know that sex ed, there's something about it that's just so awkward and it's taught by this person who doesn't really want to be there and the kids don't like it and they don't feel good about it. And as somebody who has been a sex education guest speaker in more schools that I can count in 2 different countries, I can tell you that that's not how my sex ed went. That it doesn't need to be like that, and it doesn't have to feel so uncomfortable. And so I want to reclaim conversations about sex ed because one, I'm positive that the Lord gave me a vision for it, but two, because it's a good thing that has turned a corner and become this awkward, uncomfortable, weird situation that nobody wants to do. It's interesting because I've had more parents than I can count, and maybe you have too, tell me that's the one thing I don't want to do. Like as a parent, sex ed is the one thing I don't want to confront. I'm like, wow, of all the things, like there's so much in parenting that's so difficult. That's interesting that that phrasing is what they use when it comes to conversations about sex. And again, that's where I go back to the fear, like turning our mindset to where it's not that coach shouting at kids they're going to get pregnant and dying, but rather, no, this is an opportunity I have to not only give my child correct information, but to really form their viewpoints on this important, necessary, like life-giving topic. I mean, sex is where babies come from. This is where we all begin. And to avoid that or ignore that or just put rules on it isn't how sex ed needs to be. And so I want to reclaim sex education, simply conversations about sex from that awkward scene that you have in your mind.
And what are some of the reasons that parents give you when they say things like, this is the one conversation I don't want to have, or I don't feel equipped to have it, or I'm fearful about it? What are some of the reasons that they're bringing to you of why it's so off putting for them?
So, a few things come to mind. I'm going to say three. One reason that parents tell me that, and this is the biggest one, is that they did not have good sex education. And so they have no example for how it's meant to look or how it works in a healthy Christian home. None. So that's what really terrifies them, right? They've never seen it done, they don't know what it looks like, etc. Number two, they have some trauma or abuse in their own past that they haven't dealt with. And so talking about the topic overall brings up a lot of pain and issues, understandably so, that they just haven't confronted. And they don't want that all to come up. It might even be the trauma of my husband or my wife was watching porn in our marriage. And it was this huge betrayal and it was awful, and now we have to talk about porn with, with our children. How are we? We're not supposed to do that. And so it brings up all those, like I said, understandable feelings you have about the topic itself, and you haven't totally worked through it. And so you don't know how to approach it. And then the third reason, besides a history of trauma or abuse and pain, and then not seeing it as a healthy example, that the third reason that parents are so afraid to have these conversations is because they genuinely think that they will screw up their kid forever. Like they will do this wrong, they won't do it at the right age, they won't say the right thing, and that it will set them on this path of like, I've messed up and now they're in deep trouble. And so I would say those are the three biggest reasons why parents are afraid. And I understand all of them.
It's interesting. I think what has the potential to mess children up more, like the third reason of why people are like, I'm afraid I'm going to mess my kid up, I'm going to scar them forever. I think what does that is not having the conversation or waiting too long. Like, I'd rather have a conversation with my child when they're, in air quotes, way too young. If you're not watching, I'm doing air quotes, too young, than risking not saying something or not saying something in time and them hearing about it on the playground. And so we've erred on the side of, we had the conversation fully with my son when he was probably like 6 or 7. And then he has a little brother who would have been like 4 at the time, and he was overhearing it. He obviously wasn't grasping it, but he was starting to hear us talking about it. And I'm not saying that I'm the expert, and 4 and 7 is the age to do it. I'm just saying that's what we did with our family. And some would say that's way too young. But I want them to see me as the expert on this topic. And I'd rather err on the side of, okay, you heard it a little too young than you heard it a little too late.
Yep, I completely understand that and I agree with it. What I see time and time again as I do speaking engagements or I'm out at conferences or I'm talking at schools, Christian groups, whatever, is that the kids who didn't learn, who didn't have conversations are far more at risk for so many things, sexual abuse, unhealthy relationships, unhealthy dating practices, sexting and sextortion, porn exposure, than the kids who had conversations about all of those things. I have this vivid memory of this girl, and, I get asked all sorts of things. I've been a sex education teacher for 16 years. And so I've been asked whatever you can imagine. I've probably been asked it, but there's certain kids I can still remember. And I had one girl approach my table, and this was at a Christian conference, and she was a Christian, and she was 18. And this was a conference for parents. And so it was a little like weird that she came to my table alone. And she said, "Thank you so much for what you do." And I said, "Oh, do you use my curriculum?" No. I said, "Oh, okay. Well, then what, tell me why you're thanking me for what you're doing." And she said, "Well, when I was 15, I started dating another Christian boy who my family loved. We were from a really small town and everybody really liked him. A couple years into it, I thought I'm probably going to marry this boy, and he asked me for nudes. I don't even know if it was a couple years in. She might have said like a year into it. He asked me for nudes, and I figured I'm going to marry him. And nobody's ever told me like that that's really that big of a deal. So she did. She sent him them, and he sent them everywhere and posted them and all of this stuff. And because he was a bit older than her, he actually ended up getting in legal trouble. And there was a an order where he, couldn't be around her, et cetera. I couldn't interact with the family, and it really shook up at the time, that town, and it devastated her. And she said, if my parents had told me, like, hey, when you're asked, like, never send that because it will come back to bite you. Like, it's not smart, it's not good, it's not respectful. No boy should ever ask you that. I wouldn't have done it. She's like, I'm pretty obedient. If I know like the implications, like I wouldn't have done it. And I just thought, what a simple conversation. I mean, if she's being honest with me, like that could have prevented all of that pain and all of those problems. And her pictures are still out there. And so it's just heartbreaking. And it's that again, that's not to make parents afraid, but that's to show them the opportunity we have to really encourage them to live a life that is healthy and holy and one that honors other people around us.
How is sex ed reclaimed different than this typical sex ed that we would picture? What is the curriculum like? What are these conversations like? How is it different?
So, Sex Ed Reclaimed is different, partially because of my background. I have a master's in public health and have been teaching sex ed since graduate school. I finished grad school in 2010. And a lot of times, resources for, especially around Christian sexuality, come out of maybe like counselors or, passionate parents or somebody who's gone through a crisis. And those are all fine and good things. But this is based on my experience as a sex ed teacher, like in the classrooms and in the youth groups and as a missionary abroad and with my own children, of course. And so it's a focused resource around sexual health education. But it is so much bigger than you think. Like we think of sex as being the actual act of talking about pregnancy, maybe STDs, maybe some dating stuff, but it is so much bigger than that. What makes Sex Ed Reclaim different, partially, is that I talk about all of it. I talk about identity and how feelings are not who we are, but we can recognize them. I talk about boundaries and puberty and the changing body and how miraculous it is. And I talk about abortion and I talk about sexuality and I talk about, what God tells us about these and how we can care and love people who are struggling in the world and care and love each other. However, I would say the thing that primarily makes me different is not just how big the conversation in it is and how much I cover, but is that all of my content is made for children. And so children engage with it, children watch it, children learn from it, children do the workbooks. This isn't like to ultimately motivate parents, although naturally it's going to do that by simply just, pressing play and watching with your kids. You're going to hear all of this, but it really is for the child to learn at an age appropriate level on a range of topics.
I love that you brought up that it's not just the act of sex and how babies are made, but that you get into identity and puberty and all of these things. We are not yet at I guess we're getting close to puberty. My son's 9. It's probably time for us to introduce this idea of your body is going to start changing and these are hormones and this is what might happen and don't be alarmed. And I don't have the foggiest of where to start with these things. And so I love that you've created something that is biblical, rooted in God's truth, rooted in truth about their bodies. What can parents expect in terms of, is it different like modules based on age? So, okay, you're 6 years old, watch this. Now you're 9 years old. It's your 9th birthday. Like, watch this one. What are we expecting in terms of walking through the entirety of the curriculum?
So I have 4 curriculum and they are age appropriate, like I mentioned. So I have one for toddlers and early learners, I call it. It's 3 to 6 year old. And it is my most basic. It's the shortest videos, kind of the easiest workbook, if you will. It's more simple content, but it gets at really deep issues. It's just that the children don't recognize it. So for example, one of the videos I have for 3 to 6 year olds is about boundaries and how we have boundaries to keep us safe, right? Like we can't just run across the street. We have to look both ways and we have to use crosswalks, etc. So that starts to lead them into a future of what boundaries are good for me and why, and what boundaries has God created for me that actually free me to be safe and healthy and live a life that honors him, right? So that's how it starts. And then I have a 7 to 10, an 11 to 13, and a 14 to 18 curriculum. And each of those build on each other, but you don't need to have watched the previous content to watch that content because it's all information that's for that age group spoken to that age group. And so what you're going to get in the 14 to 18-year-old curriculum is like every topic under the sun, longer videos, kind of more intense thinking and journaling and peer sharing or sibling sharing or kids sharing with their parent. But it's a little bit more thought provoking, like because this is what kids are thinking about when they're teen. Like how do I deal with the world around me and how do I actually live in this world when I now know somebody who's coming out as bi, or I have a friend who I think is in an abusive relationship. I mean, that happens in Christian worlds. When, we look out at the world and we say, oh, it's all going on out there, it starts in the home. And it starts in a lot of us too. And so we all have that nature. And so really recognizing with kids, like, this is what's happening in the world and this is how we confront that. But when they're little, it's establishing those building blocks and getting at foundational truths.
Is there separate modules based on gender? So, like, would my boys watch a different 7 to 10 than, say, my friend who has girls?
No, I firmly believe that all kids should be learning all of the same things. Like, it's kind of like you hear your girlfriend gets married and she's like, my husband didn't even know about like ovulation and when a girl can get pregnant and how. And he's a grown man, and how many times have I heard people kind of say things like that? Men need to understand periods just like women do. Of course, men won't experience them the way women do, but they need to understand the menstrual cycle, what ovulation is, what symptoms women get, how to help women, girls in that time, right? How to kind of minister to them and care for them. And so I firmly believe that boys and girls should all watch the same stuff, but I leave it up to the family to decide if they want like a similar age boy and girl to watch it together, or if that would make them uncomfortable, they can watch it separately, etc. But I really think all kids should be learning all of the same stuff. And parents can fill in the gaps around, okay, but my boy's handling the information a little bit different than my daughter. So I'm going to kind of ask them and speak to them in that way. And that's part of the reason this is so great is I'm this third party who comes in their house and talks to them. But then who do they ask all the questions to? They can't interact with me. They have to ask you as the parent. And so it fosters that relationship between the two of you, but totally opens the door for you to know, okay, what's appropriate, what's not? How do we start to talk about this? What questions do they have? And it just kind of makes it easy, right? You don't have to think of it on your own. So yeah, you don't have to do the previous age modules. You start at your age. And I recommend in order, but you can also jump around based on what the kid's interested in.
How does the program handle body parts changing and sexual responses to body parts changing? Like, as a girl mom, I don't know if I'd want my daughter to learn about how a boy is going to respond sexually and how his body will respond sexually and the body parts that respond. I feel weird saying on air like what that is, but like I don't know if I'd want my daughter exposed to that. So like, how does the module handle really sensitive body part things like that? Like if a boy is having his first erection, like do you cover that? And is a girl, like is a mom going to want her 10-year-old daughter to have that language? I don't know. Like that's where I don't know. Like what is appropriate and is that explained?
Yes. So I do explain those things.
Okay.
And like I said, boys and girls can watch the video. So if they're watching the video on male anatomy and how boys go through puberty, they will hear about a wet dream or testosterone raising in the boy's body and it creating this reaction overnight. They will hear, what an erection is. And I'm also very clear that this is information your parents are sharing with you in your home. And this is not information you go and shout about at school or you talk about with the neighbors or at the grocery store, because this is information that's should come from the parents. And so you don't need to be the one to go out and educate the other kids. Rather, their own family can do it. So I share with them because if we're not sharing with them, like they will go and find out that information elsewhere. I had two moms one time come to me on the same day, which was just, I mean, a coincidence, I guess. But really it must have been a God moment because they each came to me and told me that their child had found out what porn was because the either the adventure Bible or the action Bible, like some kid's Bible mentioned it on the sidebar of a page. It said, so and so was addicted to porn, but Jesus set him free. And each something like that. I don't know. And each child, 11, 12-year-old child, like went and looked up, well, what is that? I've never heard of that. my parents, I don't know what that is. So they each Googled porn. And one was still, addicted at this point when the mom was telling me, and another one had gone through quite a lot of counseling, basically. And so if we don't introduce the topics like you were saying earlier, then somebody else will. And so I'd rather have my daughters, yes, learn what an erection is from me than from like their friends at school or the internet or some weird source of information. I know it feels uncomfortable and weird, and I'm not prescriptive. I never say like all 9-year-olds should know this, and this. However, I do think primary educators should come from the family unit and from the parents. And so ultimately they'd be asking you. But if you only tell your son what it is, and let's say you have girls too, and you don't tell the girls, then it says, hey, there's something shameful about this topic and you shouldn't know about it because it's bad and it's mysterious, right? And that's not for you. And maybe she goes and she finds out elsewhere. So I really think you're the one who should be doing that, and it's not inherently bad, right? Like God created the erection. Can I say that? God created the erection and it's meant to help procreate. So yeah.
Yeah, sorry if I was so awkward with how I asked that question. It's an awkward topic. And you have boys that you're like, I need to address this. And you have girls that are like, you should know what this is. And then as parents, we get all flustered saying it. And that is why resources like Sex Ed Reclaimed exist, because even as intentional as I am about talking to my kids about sex, I don't know where to start with erection and puberty and all of these other things that are very important for them to understand and know about.
Yes, fair enough. Fair enough. Like I said earlier, nobody probably modeled it, right? And you haven't seen that done. And so it is kind of awkward. Plus, of course, we sexualize everything. Like, my husband is a pediatrician and he says sometimes patients will come in and this happens to me too. They'll say, my kid is masturbating and they're only 2 or they're only 1 or they're only 3. I'm sure you've heard this before too. And it's like, no, no, they're not. They're not masturbating. They are touching their genitalia. They are exploring their body, but they have no connotation of like fantasy and porn and sex and I'm going to have an orgasm from this, right? Like that is something we put on them. So sometimes we put kind of sexualized things around it because it is a sexual term, but our kid doesn't think that way, right? Like our kid is not there. And so we're making it uncomfortable because of all of our knowledge about it when actually they don't have all that knowledge. Like you get to be the first one that gives them the matter of fact, scientific, non-awkward information and not make it something, that it's not necessarily. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So, another topic that I don't know where to start with this whole conversation, and just to give you kind of some ideas of what we've done and where we're coming from, we refer to everything biologically: penis, vagina. We don't use like slang words like your wiener and stuff like that, because that's just not what we do. We use biological terms. When we've talked about sex, we've kept it very biological. The man's penis enters the woman's vagina, the sperm meets the egg. That's how a baby is conceived, and it's in the mom's uterus. And everything's been very biological. God designed sex to be between a husband and wife. The goal of sex is to create a baby. We've not yet graduated to the place of there is intimacy in sex, and God designed it for a husband and wife to be intimate and it feels good. We've not gotten to that place with sex. At what age and when is it appropriate to start introducing the idea of it being something that feels good and causes intimacy between a husband and a wife, and a husband and wife want to do it? My kids literally think that the only purpose for sex is to make a baby, and that you do it
Sure.
one time and you get your
Yep.
one baby.
Yes, totally agree. I mean, if I think about my parents, I'm like, they did it 3 times and that was it. I cannot go anywhere else with that. So it's normalizing our kids' reactions and responses when we describe things, by the way, is really good. Like being like, I totally understand why you would feel uncomfortable or you'd be surprised or you'd be curious or you'd be whatever their emotion is. Like acknowledging that is a really great place to start with whatever information you're sharing with them. And then saying that was my reaction too, or that's a lot of kids' reactions. So I introduced the concept of sexual intimacy pretty young. Between the 7 and 10-year-old curriculum, I start to talk about how sex is a way that couples express and enjoy intimacy because that's how God created it. it's not only for procreation, it's also for this. And that is why, it's so important that one day, if you get married, you choose a person who, feels the same way about God that you do, or however you might word it in your family. But it's actually, again, I would go back to what I said at the beginning. It's an opportunity to talk about, because we know, you and I know, the intimacy experienced in sex is incredible. Like if you don't have that, it stinks, right? This is a wonderful, like joyful, most of the time, not all the time, but experience that you get to have with your husband or your wife. And so expressing that is not sinful, it's not immoral, it's not taking away their innocence. It is another opportunity to say, look at what God made and how good he made it and the good he did with it, and this is what it's for. And so I actually think you can talk about that with your son already. But at this point, since you've already had some really good conversations with him, I would wait for his lead, like when you have the next conversation or when he asks a question, and use that as your opportunity and really gauge, like, okay, how much information is he wanting? Let's go step by step and see. But that's what part of why I'm not prescriptive with sex ed. Like, of course, I supply all of my videos for families to utilize, but not all children are the same, right? We all know that kids mature differently and have different experiences, and so the information they might need is a little bit different than the next kid. However, when they have questions and they want to know, like, answer honestly. Express the joy around it. The earlier you do it, actually, the easier it will be later on to continue to build upon that conversation and share about the joy that God created sex for, because kids won't get too old before they look at the world and realize, like, that is not what people are seeing sex as. They're not seeing it as a gift from God. They're seeing it as something that they can exploit, right, for their own benefit. And so that dichotomy is really actually cool for kids to see, because you can see how good God's purposes are versus like how kind of jacked up the world's purposes are. And it's much healthier that they engage in that dichotomy with you than like explore that on their own later.
So we know that there's the early learners that's very foundational. I'm assuming naming appropriate body parts and all of that. What are some key topics that we'll find in the 7 to 10, 11 to 14, and then 14 up? Like some of the differentiations and key topics in each module.
So I actually list all of this out on my website, sexedreclaimed.com, where you can go in and see, like, what exactly is she talking about with each age group. So for example, in the 7 to 10-year-old curriculum, I get a little bit into what does it look like to use a device. So making wise choices, what are bad pictures? So that would be pictures that exploit other people. I have information about sexting. Should you ever send a picture or take a picture of yourself naked? No, that's disrespectful. That's not okay. That doesn't see each other as God's image bearers. I have a frank conversation about where babies come from. I talk about setting boundaries. I talk about how to take care of like your body, dealing with a period, puberty, etc. As you get older, so in the 11 to 13-year-old curriculum, and again, this is all listed out on my website, I get a little bit more into the conversation around those things. So what does setting boundaries actually look like? Why is sexting kind of tempting, right? Like what is the pull around that? And why would somebody ever do that? And how do we actually refrain and prevent that and protect ourselves and our friends? How do we say no to somebody who is pressuring us? Why do we like attention? What is so great about that? What are hormones doing in my body? What is the anatomy of the other sex and what is the anatomy of mine? I talk about porn consumption more frankly, because that's usually when kids have been exposed. I talk about abortion more frankly in that conversation. And so then as you get older, you can see the conversations mature along with the age of the child. And the 14 to 18, like you imagine it, I pretty much do talk about it, because I would, like I've said, many times, I would rather the Christian family has this conversation than the world. And so every topic really under the sun. But in a way that's engaging. Every single video has pausing moments where they reflect, they consider their own worldview, or they have conversation with you or another child.
How can a parent avoid communicating shame and embarrassment around this topic, much like I did when I was afraid to say the word erection on the podcast? How do we not create shame and embarrassment around this topic with our children?
One recommendation that quickly comes to mind is you need to investigate your own like shame and embarrassment, right? So what is your reason for pausing? Talk about this with your spouse if you're married, right? What are we planning to do with our kids around this topic? Why not? What did we experience? I mean, my husband and I were married for almost a decade. Like I said, he's a physician, I'm in sex ed. You would have thought we really hashed out this stuff. No, like we were already parents. We still were learning about each other's past, what, encouraged sex ed in my husband's family unit versus mine, what didn't, what kept us from that, what it looked like, what were some stereotypes we picked up on. Like we were date nighting, I'll say, having those conversations over and over to figure out what our own shame and embarrassment still was. And I'm a sex ed teacher and he's a doctor. Like you would think we would be the most comfortable. And frankly, we weren't. And that honestly, sidebar, that only helped our marriage so much. Like it was so encouraging and joyful to actually unpack all of that stuff, even years later into marriage. So I would say do that first. Like discern what your spirit is or what your feelings are, what your gut is around this topic, and think about why and what your past, the ways I should say that your past informed that stance or that feeling you have. And then talk about this with your spouse and unpack, do I have any shame or embarrassment around it? And then the other thing I would say, the big recommendation is to just acknowledge it. Be like, yeah, I know this is a little uncomfortable, or I know there's like some giggles when you're with your child. Or, maybe you do talk in a car because you don't want to make eye contact around the topic. Find a place that's comfortable for you and just dig in. And honestly, practice will make it better. And so the more you do it, the easier it can get. It's not always going to get easier depending on the topic. There are really difficult topics out there, right? But it will get better the more you do it because you'll be used to having these conversations with your kids, and your kids will be used to it as well. They'll just know it's normal, kind of like you were saying with your boys in the house. Like they just know this is stuff that you talk about.
What does a conversation around modesty look like? And is it the same conversation for boys and girls? Because I feel like the modesty issue looks different for my boys. I'm trying to encourage them maybe not to look towards the direction of someone who's dressed really immodestly, where a girl mom is more inclined to trying to keep their daughter to not be the girl that's dressing immodestly where the boys are looking. Is it the same conversation, or are boy moms and girl moms having different conversations when it comes to modesty?
I think it's the same conversation. However, there are probably some nuances, I guess, that look a little bit different if you have boys versus girls because they will have different questions and different thoughts around it. We all know that men tend to be a lot more visual than women, not always, but they can be. And so it can spur these thoughts that women might not have if they see the same things. And that's difficult. Like honestly, it's still difficult for me, this topic. I actually recently, within the past year, added modesty content to my curriculum. I had kept it out originally because I had so much almost like baggage from those talks being in purity culture as a kid. And it was so heavily focused on clothes. And so that's like the only example I had around modesty. And I studied the word, and modesty is really about the heart. I mean, we think about Jesus being modest. It's not because he wore a long robe, like, it's because his heart posture was one of humility and was one of servanthood and was one of putting others, before himself. And so, sacrificing himself for others. And so that's the conversation I really have with kids. And the conversation is a little bit about clothes, but it's mostly about what kind of legacy are you leaving? What's your heart about this? Because you can be immodest showing off how expensive your jewelry is all the time, and immodest showing like how great your clothes is, even if they cover you, even if that outfit covers you up. And so the conversation becomes a lot bigger than just like, how long is your skirt? But I do talk about wanting to like steward our body well and wanting to um, respect each other with how we talk about each other's bodies and that kind of thing. So I think it's a much bigger conversation than what we grew up with, I'll say, and what we were used to. But again, it's another opportunity to really think about, what does God say modesty is and how can this apply in today's world? However, I do think it looks a little bit different for boys and girls. And some boys struggle with this more than others, and some girls struggle with this more than others. And so your conversation might change child to child based on, their season of life and their personalities as well.
This might be helpful for someone listening, but from a boy mom perspective, I heard another boy mom who's a dear friend of mine who's raised boys much better. I'm figuring it out and I'm following her as she's doing it. But we live obviously in Southern California, so we go to the beach all the time. And the bathing suits that girls wear to the beach nowadays is alarming. And she says to her boys, she will always point out and be like, that girl needs some privacy. And that's her word track. That girl needs some privacy. She may not know it, but she needs some privacy. And that's kind of their family word track to, hey, let's put our eyes somewhere else. That person needs some privacy. And I've always thought that was so good. She just doesn't realize she needs privacy, but she needs privacy.
Right. My sister mentioned that one of her boys asked, standing behind a girl at the pool, like, why do they wear, actually, you know what? It wasn't my sister, it was somebody else, but why do they wear, why is this girl like showing off her entire butt? Because yeah, this swimsuit was basically like a thong. And this person told me, the parent told me that they said, well, she thinks her body looks good and she wants to show it off, but is that good for her? And they had a pretty in-depth conversation about like, actually, no, in the long term, that isn't really good. Like, that's not really healthy for her or healthy for other people. And like, she doesn't need to do that to get attention. And so a bigger conversation around what are people seeking when they dress certain ways? They're seeking to show their personality. They're seeking to get attention. And are those healthy or unhealthy, holy, unholy? Like, that is a great opportunity too. So I remember it was a guy, actually, I don't know why I thought it was my sister. It was a guy telling me that. And it sounded like they had a great conversation.
I'm going to do something different that I've not done before and we'll see how it goes. But I'm going to have you just finish the sentence. We'll do like a rapid fire. I'll start the sentence, you finish it.
That's fun.
I know, right? I'm like, why not? Let's try it. The biggest mistake parents make when talking about sex is
Silence.
if you're waiting until middle school to talk to your kids about sex.
You're starting late, but you can still start.
Christian parents need to stop.
Thinking sex is shameful.
Christian parents need to start.
Seeing conversations about sex as an opportunity.
The most important thing every child should know about sex is
that God created it and it's a good gift, but we should honor him with how we see it, how we view it.
If parents remember only one thing from today's episode, what should they remember?
That you are the right person to start these conversations. You just need to begin.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Where can people find Sex Ed Reclaimed? I know I'm going to go and be buying this curriculum immediately. So tell us where to find it and what other resources you have that we should be looking forward to.
Sure. So I am at sexedreclaimed.com. I'm also on social media at Sex Ed Reclaimed as well. You can find my contact info. You can see little clips of videos on my website. You can even see some videos totally for free on YouTube. I have a public channel where I upload some of the content for kids and I tell you what age it's for. But mostly I'm on socials and on my website.
Well, I will be purchasing it. I ask every guest this question at the end of the episode. So I will ask you. At Raising Rock, we have 4 core values that are the heartbeat of what we do. And it's my goal to first have these character traits myself, but then to pass them along to my children. And those are respect, obedience, courage, and kindness. Which 4 of those values sticks out to you the most? And how can you just speak a word of encouragement over to moms today?
All 4 of them are great, but courage stands out to me quite a bit. We live in a really divisive world, and I would say it's actually a really afraid world. And Christians are meant to look different and be different, but they often don't. They often look the same as everybody else. And it takes great courage to live as Christ did, to stand in truth and love. And it's hard. And so courage stands out to me, like raising your children to be bold and brave in their faith, and not in a way that's, you know, for the purpose just to stand out, but in the way that is sharing the gospel and sharing Jesus with others. And that's a really courageous thing to do in our world.
Well, thank you again so much for joining us. I am hopeful that we can have you back on down the road and keep digging in. I know you have some fun projects coming up. So maybe when those projects come out, we'll have you back on to hear all about them. But we just are so thankful for your time and all the work that you're doing to help us parents with these conversations. It's such a valuable tool that you're offering.
Yes, well, it takes a village, and I love doing what I'm doing, and I'm grateful the Lord has led me to it. So thank you for having me.